Hello, students. Dr. Nathanson is here. In this talk, I want you to consider the topic of diversity. When I think of diversity, I think of two words, and that is, how can you start to appreciate and include people who are different than you? So appreciation and inclusion, I think, are two very important words. So from this talk, I want you to walk away thinking about how can you start to appreciate and include people in your life who are different than you. And to understand a little bit about your own self, where do your stereotypes and biases come from? And three, perhaps start to move forward and work a little closer with people who are different than you so that you could get to understand and appreciate others as well. When I think of all the ways that people are different, there are many. I once had a group of students do an exercise on the board of all the ways in which people are different. And we came up with over 100 ways that people are different. I mean, on one hand, we're all the same. We all have, 99% plus the same DNA. But that's on the inside. On the outside, there are differences. Some of us are taller, shorter. Some of us talk fast and some of us talk slow. We have different religions and cultural backgrounds. We have different hobbies. We comprehend differently. We make decisions differently, and on and on and on and on. So apart from race, color, cultural background, and creed, there are so many ways in which we're different. And I really want you to start to kind of start to think about that. Also think about what shapes your views on this topic. We'll talk about this in this lecture today. So diversity really means difference. And inclusion really means our ability to include those differences. It should be obvious that, when you have a team, the more different the people are on the team, the better results you're going to have. That's why, for example, if you're a manager in a business, you don't want to hire people who are exactly like you. So having a diversified team, it just makes sense. You get more creativity, you get different opinions and so on. Although that might seem common sense, there are many reasons why people are uncomfortable with this topic. First of all of us have our own biases. I don't believe it's possible to get rid of your bias, just like it's not possible to get rid of stress. It's always there. But you can become aware of your biases so you can work to minimize those biases. A lot of times we just misunderstand other cultures. I think one way to get to know people from a different culture is to visit that country where you're unfamiliar and spend some time there. And then you realize that, everybody is just like you. A lot of us are just afraid of discrimination charges. We're just afraid of conflict. So this is a very taboo topic. People would rather talk about other topics than this. So what is bias? A bias is simply an inflexible belief that you and all of us have about particular categories of people. There's different types of biases. For example, there's a race bias. Some of you may have a bias against a particular race. Some of you may have a political bias. I like Democrats. I don't like Republicans. I like Republicans. I don't like Democrats. I have this particular point of view, and you have a different view. And so that's a political bias. Gender bias is some of us just have biases against, our own gender or other genders. A common bias is something that's called recent incident bias. We have a situation occur with a particular person, and now everybody else that we run into in the future, we have a bias against them because of the incident that we had. And that's very common. Maybe, this leads to the next one, personal relationship bias. You can kind of combine these two in this example I'm going to give you. Let's say you have you're in a relationship and your relationship breaks up, and in all the ways that you consider that relationship, the type of person you're with and their behavior and what they look like and how they spoke and so on, that now you have a bias against that kind of a person. And the next time you meet someone like that, you immediately don't want to associate with them because of this bias. So that's a personal relationship bias. If you're not careful, that can happen. You may miss your potential soulmate in your life because of this prior personal relationship bias. A guerrilla bias is when you tend to favor one type of person over another, probably unfairly. let's say you believe that, single moms should be given extra compensation, extra support at work, which may or may not be true. But because of that bias, you then discriminate against people who aren't single moms, as an example. Some people have biases against their own group. These biases come from really our lived experience. They come from the way we were raised. They come from our experiences, our cultural background, and so on. And so I don't think it's possible to get rid of your bias. But the idea in this talk today is for you to start to think about how you can reduce your bias. At work, there's so many things that happen that have the potential for conflict because of our bias. Now, there's something called an unconscious bias. And an unconscious bias is first a bias that you're not really aware of, but it shows up. And it shows up in different areas. For example, stereotypes. You've heard of this. A stereotype is when you have a certain type of prejudice against a person, a group, or belief. And the danger with a stereotype is, you don't see the person, but you see the stereotype. For example, let's say that you think that I'm going to make this up. This particular cultural group are bad drivers. So now when you're driving, and you see what you consider to be a bad driver, you're going to assume that that's this kind of a person. In fact, if that's the case, you might even drive up and look at that person to prove to yourself that it's that kind of a person. And if it's not that kind of a person, you'll convince yourself that it is anyway. So our stereotypes really get in the way of our relationships with people. And so that's why, like everything in life, it's so important to be self-aware. It's also important to avoid groupthink. It's very easy to listen to the media and go with groups of people on one side or another that have certain opinions without stepping back and thinking, what's really happening here. So you want to be able to step out of your comfort zone and really own your own self-awareness and own your own bias and try to figure out where it comes from and what you can do to minimize it. You have to ask yourself, how does your bias affect you just on a daily basis? In a class, do you always sit with the same types of people because you want to avoid others? Does your bias interfere with your productivity and how you hire people and so on? There's some important terms. These are just a few that have come up in the last 2 or 3 years that I think you should know. For example, gender fluid is a person who does not identify themselves as having a fixed gender. LGBTQIA has now been expanded, right? In 2010 is one of the very few laws that protects differences. In 2010, the government said that gender reassignment is protected under the law, but that's it. And today, here, several years later, the law is still too narrow. In fact, only about 20% of companies today have employment policies that even protect the rights of LGBTQIA employees. So just some background. What can organizations do? I think it's important in organizations to keep records private, to be flexible on titles and gender identification, have training, have workshops like this to educate people. We already see, many organizations have, gender neutral toilets and uniforms and so on. Some flexibility on not having to show your photo ID. So I think that's important. So I want to give you an opportunity, a private opportunity to think about where you might have your own biases and what you can do about it. So here's what I'd like you to do. Go ahead and take a piece of paper, and I would like you to write on the left side of the paper these names, 3, 5, these 8 names I've given you, and then leave some space on the right side. So I'm going to give you about 45 seconds now. Again, get a piece of paper and write down these names and leave some space on the other side. And this exercise will help you to think about where your biases might be. Okay, let's get started. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read you each name on this list, one name at a time. Stay with me. And whenever when I tell you the name, I want you to write down whatever thoughts come to mind. All right, and don't overanalyze. Just write down whatever comes to mind. If nothing comes to mind, don't write down anything. Okay? All right, let's begin. John. Good. Mohammed. Olga. Olga. Fernando. Ajish. Tang. Lakeisha. Lakeisha. And Luganda. Luganda. So let's debrief this a little bit. What did I just do? Well, I read you 8 names that potentially come from different groups. John, maybe a white Christian male, perhaps. Mohammed, Middle Eastern guy. Olga, Eastern European woman. Fernando, could be a guy from Spain, Mexico. Ajish, probably an Indian male. Tang, possibly a Chinese male. Lakeisha, African American woman, and Luganda, an African woman. So look at what you wrote down, and ask yourself: did you have any, emotional connection with what you wrote down? Did you have any reaction at all, either an emotional reaction or just examine what you wrote down? Or did you have no feelings when I read you each of these names or one of these names, and you had just no thoughts, and you didn't write anything down? I mean, this is just a, kind of a fun test, but I have used this over the years with many people. And if you had a negative reaction to any of these names, there's a good chance you might have a bias against this particular group of people. And if that's the case, you might, do some self-reflection and think about, where does that come from? If you didn't have any reaction at all, and congratulations, it probably means, you don't have a bias against this particular group. So this is an exercise just for you to kind of, think about your own biases and where they may come from, and what you might do about it. What's interesting is when we have a bias, we really refuse to let it go. I remember once years ago, I was in a work group. It was a group of all men, and the boss had hired a woman to join our group, and she was from New York City. And as soon as we heard that, we were disappointed because we thought, a person from New York, they're going to be like pushy and loud and obnoxious. So we had this really incorrect stereotype about people from New York. Of course, New Yorkers think Californians are, kumbala, laying in the jacuzzi all day. They might be right in some cases. Anyway, she joined the group, and we were so confused because she was like the nicest person you had ever met. She was friendly, she was helpful, and we were just confused. And then one day we were in a staff meeting, and she asked a question. She just slightly elevated her voice. "Excuse me, I don't understand." And we thought, aha, New Yorker. So this is what happens. We tried to rationalize our assumptions, even if they're incorrect. If we go back to one of those names, let's imagine, let's pick, Mohammed. And I said, paint a picture of the guy Mohammed, and what you think this person might look like. And let's say that I brought my friend Mohammed into class right now, and he was 7 feet tall, Chinese, and bald. Would you be confused? Maybe, because that doesn't fit your expectation of what a person who's named Mohammed would look like. But you still would probably hang on to that and say, well, wait a minute, how come that's your name, and so on. So we tend to hang on to our assumptions, even when they're incorrect. So I want you to start to make sure that you notice people as people and not their difference, right? are not their group that they've come from. Observe your own behavior, who you hang out with. You know, if you're only hanging out with the same kind of people, once in a while, hang out with somebody who's different. That's the best way to kind of help to lower your biases. You know, organizations have challenges. I mean, many organizations work to optimize their own little group, and they sub-optimize everyone else. I think people, managers want to be inclusive, but they just don't have the training, and they're risk adverse. They're afraid to take chances. I gave you 3 videos here, which I'd like you to watch. I think they're very informative, and they'll help you understand this topic in more depth. So I think when we talk about an organization, you know, it really needs a commitment from the top. One organization I work with came up with a position which they call Global Director of Diversity. That wasn't bad. And, you know, ultimately, everyone needs to own this responsibility. It shouldn't be a department or a job position for one person. But the point here is that leadership has to start at the top. You know, if you want people to be committed to the idea of appreciation and inclusion. On your own, I'd like you to do this exercise. You know, take a piece of paper and answer the first question. The way I feel about diversity and inclusion is, and if not useful, I can change my feelings about diversity and inclusion to be more positive, encouraging, and accepting by doing what? So often it just takes some self-reflection for us to change our own behavior. Now, here's what's not to do when you build an inclusive and diversified team. You know, don't use diversity as a short-term fix. Well, we have a harassment case in the organization, so everybody takes this class, we check the box, and it's done. So don't be reactive. You want to be proactive, right? And don't hold on to perceptions that are just no longer useful, right? And don't ignore people's contributions just because of your own personal biases. Instead, I think it's important to show, you know, show diversity in everything that we do. I think it's important to have healthy conversations. If you're around a group of friends or people at, you know, lunch in the cafeteria and you hear unhealthy conversations, you have to stand up and say something. You know, when a person feels that they're not appreciated or included, they're not going to say anything, but they're going to shut down. And we don't want that. So don't spread unhealthy bias and perceptions. You know, describe people as people. Don't use kinship names. Don't say, well, go see the black guy over there. Go see the Spanish girl over there. No, go see the person. So you have to be a role model of positive behavior, and you have to include people in all of your messages, you know, in such a way that they feel included and appreciated. I've given you in class an assessment that I developed several years ago. It's a very simple, fun assessment, if you will, to take. There's 20 questions, and when you're done, you add up your score, and there's some feedback for you to help you kind of see where you are. And I'd like to encourage you on your own to take this assessment that I've placed in class and see where you are. And, you know, based on your score, perhaps maybe take it twice a year just to see, you know, where you've changed. When you add up your score, you know, take your low scores and develop a plan to see where you can improve. Take your high scores and, you know, figure out how you can continue to develop in these areas. So I encourage you to take this self-assessment, which I've developed on diversity, and I think you might find some value. And then, you know, ideally, I like to do this with a group. Of course, in this case, in our virtual lesson here, you'll do this on your own. So maybe once you take the assessment, you know, maybe write down, what did you learn from the assessment, and what are the top 3 to 5 things that you might do personally, you know, to enable a work culture to appreciate and include people. Okay, good. So if we think about a positive management system, what does that look like? It's a system where people feel that they're included, they're appreciated, it's as bias-free as possible. You know, the organization is focused on people and process. And there's a proactive sort of behavior to help develop people and not place blame. We've all been, I'm sure, in organizations where people are not included. And that's where the rumor mill starts. People bring their bodies to work, but they leave their hearts and minds at home. If you've ever been in a retail store or an organization where there where people are included, you really feel it when you walk in the door. You know, there's energy, there's collaboration. The other day I was in an Apple store, and I have to tell you, when I walked in, you know, there was so much energy. Everybody really felt like they were happy to be there. And my sense is people are probably included there. And the other day I walked in, sadly, into a Sears store, and, you know, they're going out of business, and they're, you know, they've been through bankruptcy, and people were just, you know, barely going through the motions. So when an environment, you know, includes and appreciates people, you sense it, you feel it, you see it in the environment. You know, customers are affected too. You know, when you treat people well, they will in turn treat customers well. And that affects the business with more revenue, more orders, more satisfied customers. So I think it's important to integrate this idea of inclusion and diversity into one's leadership strategy, really of yourself and of others. You know, it's important to discuss why valuing people is really important. And at the end of the day, you have to be a role model of higher integrity yourself. I worked once with an organization to help them craft their organizational vision around diversity. And, you know, they worked for a long time, and they came up with 3 words: recognize, influence, and distinguish. Not bad. Another organization I work with came up with a long sentence, which you could read here. At least it was a good effort. But I think this is important, to come up with, you know, a vision and a mission in the organization, you know, or for yourself, a personal purpose in your life, and a sense of listed values which show that you really appreciate and include others. So I think it's important to make positive changes, but one step at a time. You know, start to examine your own beliefs and biases. I always like to say, change those beliefs that, you know, they're no longer useful. You have to become a role model for promoting healthy relationships, not only at work, but in your personal life. You have to self-monitor your own thinking processes before you rush to judgment. At the end of the day, you have to do what I'm doing right now, which is teaching. You know, you have to teach people to be more inclusive, to be more appreciative. And remember that, you know, diversity comes in, you know, all shapes and sizes. It's necessary for not just a healthy work culture, but, you know, for a society. So if we look at our key learning from this lecture, you know, we all have beliefs about others. And the good news is we have the ability to change those beliefs, especially those ones that are no longer useful. I think when you include and value diversity, it must align with the culture and with the organizational strategies. You know, I know in my own life, I've seen that when people really feel included and their views accepted, you know, everything improves. Communication goes up, work relationships go up, productivity goes up. So including people and valuing diversity, it's good for people, and it's good for the business. So that's all I wanted to cover in this lecture. I hope from this talk you walk away and think about, you know, where in your own life can you start to be more appreciative and inclusive of people, you know, who are different than you. So until next time, have a great night or evening, and I look forward to seeing you soon in class. All right, take care, everyone.